On April 15, 2023, fighting between rival military factions broke out in Sudan, mostly fueled by two men trying to take control of the country. The situation in Sudan has become one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, with thousands dead, millions being displaced, and the country at risk of famine and even complete collapse, with no end in sight for the war. But how did this begin, and what are the potential outcomes for Sudan?
These are the sounds and sights of civil war.
Since gaining independence from the United Kingdom and Egypt in 1956, Sudan was plagued by military coups, forceful takeovers of the government, up until the rise of the dictator Omar al-Bashir, who seized control in his own coup in 1989. Bashir secured his position by coup-proofing, a strategy used to reduce the risk of being overthrown by fostering a network of loyalty within the armed forces. He also abolished certain governmental positions which could challenge his rule. This fortified his regime and allowed him to keep power for the next 30 years. But Bashir was opposed by the people of Sudan, who protested against his regime almost perpetually. The people of Sudan are split between Black Africans and Arabs, Black Africans being the majority population, and Arabs the minority leaders, who rule through oppression and harsh control. In 2003, a war broke out in Darfur when rebel groups rose up against Bashir and the Sudanese government, accusing them of oppressing the non-Arabic population. Bashir responded by recruiting Arab militias in the area called the Janjaweed, who proceeded in the ethnic cleansing of Darfur's non-Arabs. The Janjaweed set fire to an estimated 3,000 villages, murdering thousands, committing sexual violence against women, and leaving destruction in their wake, displacing over 2.5 million people. This was officially classified as a genocide and led to the eventual secession of South Sudan, which became an independent country in 2011. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Bashir for war crimes in Darfur and crimes against humanity. The Sudanese government refused to recognize the warrant. After this conflict, Bashir recognized the potential of the Janjaweed and organized them as his personal private militia, adding to his coup-proofing. He gave them official station, naming them the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, making them an official paramilitary of the Sudanese government. The RSF was renowned as a brutal and ruthless fighting force, and 40,000 of them were deployed to fight in an ongoing civil war in Yemen in exchange for money, which gave them lots of fighting experience. Their leader, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemedti, was granted wealth and power by Bashir in order to keep him close as a friend. Hemedti was given several gold mines, which allowed him to accumulate a massive amount of money. Remember the gold mines, they'll be important later. After the separation of South Sudan, which contained massive oil reserves and had contributed to the country's wealth, the economy of North Sudan plummeted. Bashir's bolstering of military allies, including the Sudan Armed Forces, or SAF, giving them wealth in order to keep them close, was resented by the population, who rose up in protest against Bashir's regime. After nationwide protests, Hemedti and the leader of the SAF, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, conspired against Bashir and joined forces to overthrow him on April 11, 2019. Burhan ultimately became head of state for Sudan, with Hemedti as his vice president of the country. But the people of Sudan didn't want a military occupation, so they protested again, calling for the establishment of a civilian government. The protests were met with force by the RSF, who killed over 100 protesters, throwing some of the bodies into the Nile River, and dozens more were sexually assaulted. This caught the attention of the African Union, who forced the leaders of Sudan to establish a civilian military unity government. Sudan appointed a prime minister and planned for democratic elections in 2023. But General Burhan had other plans. In 2021, he led a military coup against the civilian government, throwing out the prime minister and taking control once again for himself. After pressure from the international community, including the United Nations, the African Union, and the United States, the military rule over Sudan was to give power back to the civilian government in a deal, which included merging the two military powers into one. The RSF had an estimated 100,000 troops, with the SAF having over 200,000. But there was disagreement between Burhan and Hemedti. Burhan wanted the two militaries to be joined within 2 years, and Hemedti wanted it to be done in 10 years. Hemedti had used the mines to get into the pocket of Russia, who developed a close relationship with him and the RSF financially. with some saying that the gold from Sudan has been a large funding of Russia's war in Ukraine. In fact, Hemeti was in Moscow the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, so Hemeti had a lot of power and wealth that he wasn't willing to give up that easily. With the disagreement on the militaries joining, Hemeti began mobilizing troops and ordering unauthorized military movements of the RSF across the country, which Burhan declared as illegal. Finally, on April 15, 2023, tensions boiled over into full-scale fighting across Sudan as Hemeti attempted to take control of the country using the RSF. Through the course of 2023, after fighting began in April, the war has only intensified and grown more violent. The RSF has left behind them a bloody trail by using the same tactics they used in the 2003 Darfur genocide. Looting and destroying towns to help fund their war, and using terror tactics to force men into joining their cause. They were reported to have gone door to door in some towns, executing whoever was inside. They've also used a campaign of sexual violence against women in towns they raid to fuel terror. Because of internet blackouts and military suppression of media, there's been no way to get exact numbers on casualties, but it's been reported that more than 12,000 people have been killed, with more than 7.2 million people being displaced. Over 3.5 million children are at risk, and there's a very alarming cholera outbreak that's sweeping the war-torn nation. Efforts for humanitarian organizations have been unable to get sufficient funds into the country due to the raging war. The conflict is now known as the Forgotten War because the rest of the world has turned away from Sudan, focusing on the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and leaving the humanitarian situation in Sudan unresolved. Despite the SAF having an air force and more fighting troops, their best efforts to suppress the RSF have been in vain. The RSF's fighting experience in Yemen and other countries has proven to be too much for Sudan's military, to the point where locals are forming their own militias and rising up to defend themselves against the RSF. The RSF is winning, and they're destroying the country in the process, but they have no capability to govern the people. They can rule with force, but wouldn't be accepted either by the people of the country or externally by the international community. This is an uncertain and dangerous time for Sudan. It's very frightening to think what could remain of the Sudanese state when this war is over. And it seems that the threat of collapse is very real. The humanitarian crisis will only get worse from here, with untold amounts of innocent people exposed to war, famine, and disease. If you have any means of supporting aid in Sudan, there will be links in the description to donate. And as always, thank you for watching.